Welcome to Ancient Relics Keeper, where lost truths, ancient mysteries, and forbidden history collide. Let's question the past and uncover what was never meant to be found. In 1562, a French colony vanished in North America. For centuries, their fate was a mystery. Now, a discovery on a remote Florida island reveals they didn't just disappear, they found one of the largest Native American cities on the continent. The story of European colonization in North America is often told through a few iconic, almost mythologized starting points. The English Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock in 1620, or the establishment of the Jamestown colony in Virginia in 1607. These narratives, centered on English-speaking Protestants, have become the foundational myths of the United States, shaping the popular understanding of the continent's origins. But the true history of European attempts to gain a foothold in the New World is far older, more complex, and filled with forgotten chapters and tragic failures. One of the earliest and most significant of these lost stories is that of Charlesfort, a French Protestant colony established half a century before Jamestown. It was a bold venture born from religious strife, a desperate attempt to create a haven in a new land. Its rapid and mysterious collapse has long been a historical footnote, a tale of hardship and failure. For nearly 450 years, the fate of its colonists was a puzzle, presumed to have ended in starvation or a desperate, doomed voyage across the Atlantic. The mystery of Charlesfort, however, was not just about a failed colony. It was the prelude to a remarkable and completely unknown story of first contact. The impetus for the Charlesfort expedition came from the violent religious turmoil that was tearing 16th-century France apart. The Protestant Reformation had spread across Europe, and in France its followers, known as Huguenots, found themselves in a bitter and often bloody conflict with the dominant Catholic monarchy. Faced with escalating persecution, one of the most powerful Huguenot leaders, Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, developed a visionary and audacious plan. He sought to establish a series of French colonies in the Americas that would serve a dual purpose. They would act as a refuge for persecuted Huguenots, a place where they could practice their faith freely, far from the reach of the French crown. At the same time, they would be strategic outposts for France, challenging the dominance of Catholic Spain, which had already claimed vast territories in Florida and the Caribbean. Coligny's plan was to create a Protestant crescent in the New World, a network of havens that would be both a spiritual sanctuary and a geopolitical weapon. In 1562, the first of these expeditions set sail from the French port of Le Havre. It was commanded by Jean Ribault, a skilled and experienced mariner and a devout Huguenot. With 2 royal ships and about 150 colonists, Ribault crossed the Atlantic, deliberately avoiding the Spanish-controlled territories of the Caribbean. He made landfall on the coast of what is now Florida, near the mouth of the St. Johns River, which he claimed for France and named the River of May. From there, he sailed north along the coast, scouting for a suitable location for his colony. He was deeply impressed by the lush, fertile landscape and the seemingly friendly and welcoming nature of the indigenous people he encountered, the Timucua. He described the land as the fairest, fruitfulest, and pleasantest of all the world. Ribault finally selected a site on a small island in a well-protected harbor, which he named Port Royal. This location is now known as Paris Island, South Carolina. Here, the colonists set about building their settlement, a small triangular fort they named Charlesfort in honor of their king, Charles IX. The fort was a modest affair, constructed from earth and logs, but it was a symbol of their immense ambition. It was the first French foothold in North America, and one of the very first Protestant settlements in the New World. Having established the colony, Ribault made a fateful decision. Believing the settlement to be secure and confident in the friendliness of the local tribes, he decided to return to France to gather more supplies and colonists to reinforce Charlesfort. He left behind a small garrison of 27 men, under the command of a captain named Albert de la Pierria, with the promise that he would return with a relief fleet within 6 months. Ribault's departure marked the beginning of the end for the first iteration of Charlesfit. His return to France coincided with a fresh outbreak of the French Wars of Religion. The country was plunged into chaos, and Admiral Coligny's plans for the New World were put on hold. The promised relief fleet for Charlesfit was never sent. Stranded on a remote and unfamiliar continent, the small garrison at Charlesfit quickly fell into despair. Their initial friendly relations with the local Native American tribes soured, likely due to the colonists' increasing demands for food as their own supplies dwindled. The leadership of Captain de la Pierria became tyrannical and brutal, and he was eventually killed by his own men in a mutiny. The colonists, facing starvation and with no sign of Ribault's return, made a desperate and extraordinary decision. Using local materials and with the help of some of the more sympathetic indigenous people, they constructed a crude, open boat, a vessel barely fit for coastal travel, and set off on an audacious attempt to sail back across the 3,000 miles of the Atlantic Ocean. The story of this voyage is a testament to both human endurance and folly. They ran out of food and water, and were reduced to drinking seawater and chewing on their own leather shoes. When one of their number died, he was eaten by the others. They were on the verge of death when, by a sheer miracle, they were spotted and rescued by a passing English ship. A handful of the original colonists finally made it back to Europe, their harrowing tale serving as the only record of the colony's collapse. This, for centuries, was where the story of Charlesfit ended. It was a short-lived and tragic failure, a minor episode in the grand saga of colonization. However, the historical accounts of the colony's collapse left a number of tantalizing and unanswered questions. The story of the desperate sea voyage accounted for most of the garrison, but was it the whole story? Was it possible that not all of the colonists had agreed to embark on such a suicidal journey? It is conceivable that a small group, perhaps disillusioned with the mutinous leadership or simply too afraid to risk the open ocean in a makeshift boat, decided to take their chances by staying behind. Their only hope for survival would have been to abandon the failing fort and seek refuge with one of the local Native American tribes, whose knowledge of the land and ability to procure food was their only path to survival. For 450 years, this possibility remained pure speculation. The fate of any potential survivors, the lost colonists of Charlesfit, was a complete and total mystery, a ghost story haunting the coast of South Carolina. There was no archaeological evidence, no mention in later Spanish or English records, and no oral tradition among the descendant Native American communities. It was as if any who had stayed behind had simply vanished from the face of the earth, absorbed into the vast unwritten history of the American continent. The disappearance was absolute, leaving a blank page in the book of history that no one knew how to fill, until a remarkable discovery hundreds of miles to the south began to provide the first, astonishing clues. While the mystery of the lost Charlesfit colonists faded into an obscure historical footnote, a completely separate and far more ancient story was lying dormant beneath the shifting sands of a remote barrier island, off the coast of modern-day Jacksonville, Florida. This place, known as Big Talbot Island, is a landscape of serene and rugged beauty, characterized by salt marshes, dense maritime forests, and dramatic, weathered bluffs. For centuries, it was known to have been part of the vast territory of the Timucua people, a powerful and populous Native American group that dominated northeastern Florida and southeastern Georgia at the time of European contact. Archaeologists knew that the Timucua had inhabited the island, but the prevailing assumption was that their settlements were relatively small, perhaps seasonal fishing camps or modest villages. No one was prepared for what a team of archaeologists from the University of North Florida, led by Dr. Keith Ashley, would ultimately uncover there. Their patient and meticulous excavations would peel back the layers of earth to reveal not a simple village, but a forgotten metropolis, the sprawling, powerful, and sophisticated capital city of a major indigenous chiefdom, a place known on the earliest maps as Sarah Bay. The investigation on Big Talbot Island did not begin with a dramatic, accidental discovery. It was the result of years of careful research, guided by faint clues left behind on centuries-old maps. The earliest French and Spanish maps of the region, drawn in the 16th century, depicted a large and significant Native American town named Sarabay, located near the mouth of the St. Johns River. These maps, while historically invaluable, were often geographically imprecise. For years, the exact location of Sarabay remained a mystery. Dr. Ashley and his team hypothesized that Big Talbot Island, with its strategic location offering access to both the rich resources of the ocean and the inland waterways, was a likely candidate. They began their work with a series of small, exploratory test pits, hoping to find evidence of a settlement that matched the descriptions of the legendary town. The initial findings were promising, but did not immediately reveal the true scale of what lay beneath. The team found typical Timucuan artifacts, fragments of a distinctive type of pottery decorated with stamped patterns, shell tools, and the fossilized bones of fish and animals that made up the local diet. These finds confirmed a significant Timucuan presence on the island. However, as the excavations expanded, the team began to realize that they were dealing with something far larger and more complex than they had ever anticipated. The test pits consistently revealed deep layers of cultural material, indicating a long and continuous period of occupation. More tellingly, the sheer density of the artifacts and the features they were uncovering pointed to a large, concentrated population. They were not digging in a small village, they were digging in the heart of a city. As the full extent of the site was gradually revealed through further excavation and remote sensing technologies like ground-penetrating radar, a breathtaking picture of a forgotten urban center emerged. Sarabay, it turned in, was the capital of the powerful Makama chiefdom. The Makama were a distinct linguistic and cultural group within the larger Timucua nation, their name meaning the sea or the ocean, a reflection of their mastery of the coastal environment. Their capital city was a masterpiece of indigenous urban planning and social organization. At the heart of the city was a massive open public plaza. This was not just an empty space. It was a carefully planned and maintained civic and ceremonial center, likely used for public gatherings, religious rituals, political councils, and communal games. The scale of the plaza alone suggested that it was designed to accommodate a population of thousands. Surrounding this central plaza were the remains of numerous large, circular structures. Post-hole patterns in the ground, some several feet in diameter, indicated the presence of monumental buildings, some of which may have been up to 60 feet across. These were not ordinary dwellings. They were likely council houses, the residences of the paramount chief, or ceremonial temples. Constructed from massive wooden poles and covered with thatched roofs of palmetto leaves, these buildings would have dominated the city's skyline, powerful symbols of the chief's political and religious authority. The ability to marshal the labor and resources to construct and maintain such monumental architecture is a clear indicator of a highly organized, socially stratified society. Beyond the central ceremonial precinct, the archaeologists found evidence of a dense residential zone, with the remains of hundreds of smaller family dwellings. The city was a bustling, populous place. The most striking evidence for the size of the population came from the enormous shell middens found at the site. These were not just garbage heaps. They were vast, layered mounds of discarded oyster shells, animal bones, and broken pottery, accumulated over centuries of continuous habitation. The sheer volume of these middens, some covering several acres, is a direct and powerful testament to the thousands of people who once called Sarabay home. By analyzing the contents of these middens, archaeologists could reconstruct the diet and lifestyle of the inhabitants, confirming their reliance on the rich marine estuaries of the region. The discovery of the sheer scale and complexity of Sarabay fundamentally challenged the traditional, often simplistic, view of the indigenous societies of this region. The Makama were not simple, egalitarian bands of hunter-gatherers. They were a complex chiefdom, a form of society that is politically and socially stratified, with the powerful hereditary chief at its apex. This chief would have held authority over a network of smaller, subsidiary villages throughout the region, demanding tribute in the form of food, goods, and labor. The wealth and power of the chief were displayed through his ability to host great feasts, to fund the construction of monumental buildings, and to lead his people in warfare and ritual. The Makama had a sophisticated understanding of their coastal environment, and they had engineered it to support a large, stable population for centuries. They managed the local fisheries, harvested vast quantities of oysters, and practiced a form of horticulture, growing crops like corn, beans, and squash in small gardens. They were also deeply enmeshed in a long-distance trade network that connected them to other communities far inland. Archaeologists at Sarabay have found stone tools made from chert and other materials that are not found on the coast, but were quarried hundreds of miles away in the interior of Florida and Georgia. They have also found pottery styles that are characteristic of other regions, indicating a regular exchange of goods and ideas. This was not an isolated community. It was the powerful and prosperous center of a sprawling regional world. The Makama had a rich artistic and ceremonial life. Their distinctive stamped pottery is both functional and beautiful, and the iconography found on some artifacts hints at a complex cosmology and mythology. The great circular council houses and the central plaza were the stages upon which this vibrant cultural life unfolded. The unearthing of Sarabay was in itself a monumental achievement in American archaeology. It revealed the existence of a major indigenous metropolis that had been lost to history, providing a rich, detailed picture of a complex and successful Native American civilization that had thrived long before the arrival of Europeans. The city was a testament to the ingenuity, resilience, and sophistication of the Makama people. But the archaeologists at Big Talbot Island were about to make another, even more astonishing discovery. As they carefully sifted through the soil in the 16th century layers of this great Makama city, they began to find artifacts that did not belong, objects that were completely alien to the Timucuan world. These were objects of European origin, and they would provide the first tangible clue to solving the 450-year-old mystery of what had happened to the lost colonists of Charlesfort. The unearthing of Sarabay on Big Talbot Island was a monumental discovery in its own right, a revelation that fundamentally reshaped the understanding of pre-Columbian societies in the American Southeast. It replaced the outdated image of scattered small-scale villages with a vibrant picture of a populous, sophisticated, and powerful indigenous metropolis. But the story of this forgotten city was about to become intertwined with another much younger mystery, the 450-year-old riddle of the lost French colonists from Charlesfort. As the archaeological team from the University of North Florida meticulously worked their way through the layers of the Makama capital, they began to find objects that were startlingly out of place. Embedded within the secure, undisturbed context of 16th-century Timucuan life, alongside the native pottery and shell tools, were undeniably European artifacts. This was the critical moment when two separate historical narratives, one of a thriving Native American city and one of a failed European colony, converged. The evidence found on Big Talbot Island would not only solve the long-standing mystery of the lost Frenchman but would also paint a new and remarkably complex picture of first contact, one defined not by immediate conflict and domination, but by negotiation, adaptation, and a period of peaceful coexistence. The discovery of the European artifacts was not a single dramatic event, but a slow and cumulative process of realization. As excavators carefully sifted through the soil of what they had identified as 16th-century Makama dwellings, they began to find small, anomalous objects. The first were fragments of unfamiliar ceramics. The local Timucua pottery, known as St. John's ware, is distinctive. It is a gritty, chalky earthenware, often decorated with stamped patterns. The new fragments were different. They were pieces of stoneware, a type of high-fired ceramic that was common in 16th-century France but completely unknown in pre-contact North America. The chemical composition and manufacturing style of this stoneware were unmistakably European. These were not trade goods from another Native American group. They were pieces of pottery that had crossed the Atlantic Ocean. As the excavations continued, the number and variety of these foreign objects grew. The team found small, brightly colored glass beads, items that were highly valued by Europeans as trade goods for their novelty and beauty. They found hand-wrought iron nails, of a type used in European carpentry and shipbuilding, completely different from the bone, shell, and stone fasteners used by the Makama. Perhaps most significantly, they unearthed metal tools, including the cutting edge of an iron axe head and parts of a halberd, a type of pole weapon commonly used by 16th-century European soldiers. Each of these artifacts on its own would have been an intriguing find, but found together, in a secure archaeological context, they formed an undeniable pattern. This was not the debris of a brief, passing encounter with the European ship. This was evidence of a sustained European presence, a group of people living and using their own distinctive material culture within the heart of the Makama capital. The crucial next step was to identify the origin of these artifacts. Were they Spanish, from the expeditions of Ponce de Leon or Hernando de Soto, or were they French? The historical context provided the most likely answer. The artifacts were being found in archaeological layers that dated precisely to the mid-16th century, the exact time period when the Charlesfort colony was established and collapsed, just a few hundred miles up the coast. The specific types of ceramics and metalwork were also highly consistent with the material culture known to have been used by the French during this period. The evidence strongly suggested that these were not just any European artifacts. They were the lost belongings of the vanished colonists of Charlesfort. The men who had been presumed lost to the sea or to starvation had not all vanished. At least some of them had survived, and their journey had led them here, to the bustling metropolis of Sarabay. This pattern of dispersal is critically important. It suggests that the French objects were not the spoils of war, but were items that had been integrated into the daily lives of the Makama people. It points towards a period of peaceful interaction, trade, and exchange. The most logical and compelling interpretation of this evidence is that the surviving colonists from Charlesfort, after abandoning their failed fort, had traveled south seeking help. They would have been a small, desperate, and starving group of men, in no position to be conquerors. They arrived not as invaders but as refugees. They encountered the powerful and populous Makama chiefdom, and instead of being met with hostility, they were apparently accepted, or at least tolerated. They found refuge in the great city of Sarabay. The story that emerges from the archaeology is one of coexistence. The French survivors would have brought with them the few possessions they had left: their metal tools, their weapons, perhaps some clothing and pottery. These items, particularly the metal tools, would have been objects of immense curiosity and value to the Makama, who did not have metallurgy. The Frenchmen, in turn, would have been completely dependent on the Makama for their survival, relying on them for food, shelter, and protection. This would have created a dynamic of mutual exchange. The French colonists likely traded their valuable metal goods for food and acceptance into the community. Over time, as the French objects were used, broken, and discarded, they became part of the archaeological record of the Makama city, silent witnesses to this extraordinary cross-cultural encounter. The Frenchmen were not living in a separate, fortified compound. They were living among the Makama, their lives and their material culture becoming interwoven with that of their indigenous hosts. This discovery on Big Talbot Island fundamentally rewrites the traditional story of first contact in North America. The popular narrative, shaped by later, more violent encounters, is often one of immediate and inevitable conflict. It is a story of European technological and military superiority, leading to the swift conquest and subjugation of Native American peoples. The evidence from Sarabay presents a much more complex and nuanced picture. It reveals a moment in time, before the full devastating force of European colonization was unleashed, when the relationship between the two worlds was far more balanced. In 1562, the handful of French survivors were not the masters of the New World. They were a weak and desperate minority. The true power in the region lay with the paramount chief of the Makama, who presided over a city of thousands and controlled a vast territory. The survival of the Frenchman depended entirely on his grace and his political calculations. He could have easily had them killed, but he chose not to. Perhaps he saw them as a curiosity, or as a potential source of valuable trade goods and useful information about the outside world. Perhaps he saw them as potential allies in his own regional conflicts with other chiefdoms. Whatever his reasoning, the result was a period of peaceful coexistence. This story challenges our preconceived notions of who was civilized and who was a savage. The Frenchmen, representing the great powers of Europe, were reduced to a state of near helplessness, their survival dependent on the sophisticated social structure and well-managed environment of a Native American society. The Makama, in turn, demonstrated a capacity for diplomacy, curiosity, and political pragmatism in their dealings with these strange newcomers. The encounter at Sarah Bay was not a simple story of European domination. It was a complex negotiation between two very different, but equally sophisticated societies. It reveals a moment of contingency, a brief window of time when the future of the continent had not yet been written, when a different kind of relationship between the old world and the new seemed possible. The discovery that the lost colonists of Charlesfort found a home in the Makama capital is more than just the solution to a historical mystery. It is a profound and important corrective to the simplified narratives of American history. It reminds us that the story of first contact was not a single monolithic event, but a series of thousands of individual encounters, each with its own unique dynamics and outcomes. The artifacts from Big Talbot Island provide a rare and precious glimpse into one of those encounters, a moment when two worlds met not with the clash of swords, but with the cautious exchange of goods, ideas, and a shared, if temporary, space. It is a powerful testament to the complexity of the past and a tribute to the forgotten city of Sarah Bay, a metropolis that not only sustained its own people for centuries, but also provided a final unexpected refuge for the first lost colony of North America. The story of Sarah Bay and the Charlesfort survivors is not just about a lost colony found. It is a rare glimpse into a moment in time when the future of a continent could have gone in a very different direction. Thanks for exploring with Ancient Relics Keeper. Stay curious, question everything, and remember the truth is often buried deeper than we think.